Yes.
Okay, so hello and welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have all of you with us today. And this is actually a very exciting day for us at AREN, as this is our very first session in our series of AREN Echoes, which is about the community. And it's hoping to stir the community discussion around different topics of open science. So I would like to remind all of you of our code of conduct. We would like to embrace our diversity, promote constructive communication, foster collaboration and sharing, and maintain professionalism in this agreement. And if you encounter any breach in this code of conduct from any of the participants today, please feel free to contact us at team@africa.org or use the incident report form, which we could share the link to in the chat. So, as you might know, AREN is about fostering or helping African scholars into a journey towards open science that would hopefully lead to excellence in Africa. And we've been working with many different sub-programs in AREN trying to do that. But of course, today, this is a brand new program that we're excited to explore with you. And it's AREN Echoes. And as I said, this is a series of sessions that are for the community, by the community. So in each session, we will have one of you, our community members, who will come and present a topic maybe related to their work, but most importantly, related to open science or discussing one of the main themes of open science. So as I said, AREN Echoes is for the community by the community. So just in case that you're not part of our community, you could use this QR code to scan it to join our community. We will also share these links in the chat. And you could also, if you are interested in presenting in our AREN Echoes series, please, you could also scan this QR code, and we will have to have you as a presenter in this series. Okay, so let's welcome our community member today, we're so excited that we're kicking off this exciting journey with. It's Dr. Douaa Mugahid, and her topic today is about public data as an asset in the age of AI. And before I hand it over to Douaa, I just wanted to stress about the role of public data in open science. So public data is actually mainly about freely providing research data and making these data accessible to everyone in the scientific community and the public, and hence the name public data. So these are data that belong to the public. They are usually generated from the public and belong to the public. And of course, this has many benefits. One of them is that it enhances transparency and reproducibility because everyone could see the data and verify the data. And it also boosts global collaboration. And this will, of course, accelerate innovation and discovery around science. And of course, the very important thing is that it removes the barriers around access and democratizes information. And of course, this will, at the end, will foster a culture of shared knowledge. And all of this is very, ties quite strongly to open science and the different ethos of open science and different principles that open science is trying to teach. So with that, sorry for the long introduction, but I'll give the floor to Douaa, our speaker today, and Douaa, the floor is yours. Douaa, you're muted.
Okay. Now you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
I'm gonna reshare because I got lost in Zoom land. Um, but can everyone now see my full screen? I assume so. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Demise. I'm like, what am I doing here? Everyone's already gotten the most important bits of the talk from you, which I think is really important, as you pointed out, to keep in mind why open data and public data is such an asset in this day and age. But I maybe will go into that in a bit more depth. And as Lemis already pointed out, in my current role, I'm a research scientist, and I'm very interested in the use of multi-omics to understand host pathogen interaction, and the use of big data, whether private or public, for public health monitoring. And within that role, a big part of it is serving as the data officer for an international consortium called High Impact TB, which is using multimodal data to inform TB vaccine design. So this is sort of the angle and the perspective from which a lot of what I'm saying is going to come from today. And previously, also for additional context, I'm originally from Egypt and I got my bachelor's degree in biotechnology from the German University in Cairo. I have a PhD in systems biology where I use multi-omics to study muscle mass preservation in hibernating bears. And I also did my postdoc using multimodal data and integrating with mathematical modeling to study the role of a signaling pathway called Hippo in cell size and organ size regulation. And I also have a bit of experience in publishing, having been the editor for the systems and computational biology field at Nature Communications. And during that time, I also more broadly handled public papers in like method development in digital health. So an overview of my talk today is that I will touch a little bit on motivating why data is so important, which, as I mentioned, Lemis put very nicely already. A little longish foray into how we organize research data today, in case that's helpful to some of you in your research, and how I think we should be organizing or will be organizing research data in the future, and how embracing some of these practices and certain practices can help Africa leapfrog into the age of AI. So to start, like why is data so important? It's well, data informs our understanding of the world around us, and like evolutionarily, we've all evolved as humans and other creatures to have biological sensors that collect information about the environment around us, and that is synthesized in our brains and helps us understand the world, how to stay safe, etc., etc. So we already, as part of our day-to-day life, as animals, are constantly collecting data and surveying the environment to make smarter choices. Now, with technological development, we have come up with a lot of different tools that allow us to collect a lot more types of data and augment our abilities as humans or as animals to understand the world around us. So whether it's satellites, whether it's microscopes, sequencers, or data collected by social media and on the internet more generally, this is all data that can be used to help us understand the world in which we live and ourselves, obviously. Um, and data has become more central. It's always been important, right, for research and people who are curious about understanding the world, but it's become more central in this day and age, especially in the digital world. And by some people's, wording, it is the new oil because it fuels the breakthrough technologies of this age. Whether we're talking about OpenAI, who, are the company behind ChatGPT, whether it's Google, Microsoft, and the likes, whether it's DeepMind, the company behind AlphaFold, which I will touch on later, and whether it's a company like Salesforce that uses human behavior to improve e-commerce outcomes. This is all fueled by data, whether it's public or private, but a lot of it is your data as individuals. So data is really important. It's driving the major innovation in the tech industry today, and it touches on other industries, as I will point out during this talk. So because data is increasingly precious, like there's this increasing awareness about the preciousness of data, funders have been issuing a lot of data sharing mandates. This has been to increase the impact of funded research. You know, the original motivation for why funders were doing this, you know, it's been done for a long time. Wellcome Trust, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, everyone's been trying to do this, but it's with AI coming center stage, right? And people realizing how disruptive AI as technology is going to be, the tone has become much harsher. So you will see here a mandate from the White House Office of Science and Technology, where they're basically saying, starting 2025, all the data that and the papers that has been publicly funded by the US government has to be made public, right? There's like no embargoes, nothing of the sort. Everything has to be publicly available. So that's like a serious escalation in tone from the US government, for example. Historically, as Lemis has already pointed out, the reason why funding agencies were so keen on data sharing was because they thought this is going to help ensure reproducibility. It's sad that this is even a reason, but this was the historical reason for why the original effort started. And as you can see here, this was a survey done by Nature, I think around 2016, where they asked about 1,500 researchers whether they thought there was a reproducibility crisis. And about 90% of them thought there was a crisis in some form, and about 50% thought that this was a significant crisis. Now, at the time, Nature was not very strong. It didn't have a presence in the social sciences at the time. So, you know, this field is not represented in this like more detailed breakdown of these responses. But the chemistry, physics, earth and environmental sciences people had more confidence in the data in their field. I think it's maybe because these fields are a bit more mature than others. And so they found ways to sort of like eyeball others' work and really make sure that it's relatively reproducible. I won't go into the details here, but biology, medicine, and other fields, you know, much less so. And you know, some of these are very, very expensive studies that are performed, and it's really sad that reproducibility is an issue. And and if you're really interested in like more stories about reproducibility crisis, high profile stories, there's this guy, Pete Judo, who has a YouTube channel and has been talking about this for a while. So if you are interested in some of those stories, please do check out his channel. And the main reason, the more exciting reason, in my opinion, is like science and innovation depends so much on data. And you know, it's an incremental process. I generate some data, someone else is going to use it and build on it, and so on. And so this is really the social contract that the funders and the taxpayers are giving the, say, government money to fund your research, which is very expensive, right? Like labor is expensive, all the reagents, the machines, all of that, with the idea that you are going to share this knowledge in some form. Historically, this knowledge was like shared as papers, before that, you know, written on papyrus, and before that on the structures and caves and whatnot. So some form, right? And this is always evolving. Right now, it's like the digital paper, let's say. And as data has become increasingly expensive to generate and increasingly complex and useful for things beyond the original intent of the data, there's also this increasing understanding that the data itself in many forms will be shared. And the idea is that this data is then, and the papers that provide context about this data will be shared with other researchers, and that this is going to fuel the economy and improve health outcomes. So, and I will just caveat that this idea that the data that you generate is your data is fundamentally flawed. This data is the grant agency's data, and you are just the steward of that data. So thinking about it as yours is, you know, I don't think so the right mindset to adopt. Now, a few examples of breakthroughs that were enabled by public data involved the first and foremost, right, ChatGPT, which is turning into a multi-billion-dollar business. It's allegedly trained on all the text, images, and videos on the internet, including scientific research papers, open access and not open access, which is a reason for a lot of like litigation and you know, legalities I won't go into, but that's one very notable example that really put AI front and center in many people's minds. Before that, there was AlphaFold, which is a model that was trained on sequencing and protein structure data, curated by and generated by scientists over many, many years and put in the public domain. And this allows now this model to use structural information, sequence information to predict the protein structure of many proteins that have not been even experimentally structured or crystallized, or the structure hasn't been experimentally verified yet. So it was a huge step for humanity. They've relied very heavily on public data, and when it's discovers, I won't say discovers, but it's the leaders of the effort, let's say the Lasker Award. And less talked about, but also very important, was actually this model and underlying database called NextStrain, which was used to do a lot of like real-time tracking of of SARS-CoV-2 during the COVID pandemic. It builds on a lot of viral sequencing data that was made available by the community in real time to understand how the virus was changing over the course of the pandemic. So also very influential, and was for a very long time overlooked until it was picked up by the community during the COVID-19 pandemic. So some really fun examples. And I would like to say that at the heart of these successes is FAIR data, which and FAIR data is like stands for find data that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So findable is like, I know how to find it. Accessible, it's not behind a paywall. Interoperable in the sense that it can be mashed together with other types of data, and reusable in that like someone else can look at this data and understand what it is and understand how they can make use of it for other purposes. And I think it's really important when you think about reusability to not only think about other human beings, you know, who maybe are very well seasoned in the field and understand human errors and human behavior and can sort of interpret the data in more nuanced ways, but also think about machines that don't have all of that skills, although they're clearly getting smarter and smarter. Because there's so much data out there, like just a human sitting there, or even a team of very intelligent humans sitting there, are probably not going to be able to do the amount of pattern recognition and synthesis that is needed to make sense of some of the data that we have today. So reusability, always think about humans as well as machines. And for data to be usable, it requires a lot of context. I mentioned earlier, like papers describing a data set being the context in which it is found, but that's really a very poor way to do this at scale. And I'll get into that in a couple of slides. But think about this. I give you a bunch of data points, right? They're scattered somewhere. And I'm like, well, please make sense of this data and use it in some meaningful way. And I give you no other information. Not really helpful to really make sure you understand how these data points are connected to each other. You need the metadata fabric, which is the lines that, you know, connect all of these together and help you make sense of it. So metadata is all about giving data context, and it's also data, right? It's also digital, like, or it can be digital, right? And it's just data that describes the other data and gives it context. And good metadata, just a few like big broad lines here, is data that can be interpreted by both a machine and humans. You should have key elements that are agreed upon by people in the field or who could be using this data in the future, such that everyone who is generating similar data is capturing these elements. And when I'm comparing and contrasting data sets, I could see why this one is very different from this one. You also need standardized vocabularies because, well, it's good for humans to know to be using the same language. That's like a main and important philosophical concept, but also for machines who won't be able to tell the difference between two things that should mean the same thing, but it doesn't have like that human understanding, and dictionaries, which help also with this understanding and comprehension part. So an example from the life sciences, we were doing an experiment. We want to understand or analyze a particular sample, an analyte, a protein. And I do this with a Luminex assay that involves two antibodies, slightly different features. And I want to describe this experiment in a way that someone can understand what I'm trying to do. So I will tell you like what my analyte is. So is it a blood sample? Is it a tissue of some other kind? What's its name and what's its origin story, right? But then each of these antibodies, I will also describe what is the epitope that was meant to be identified? Who's the vendor? What's the product? What's the lot number even? And what concentration was it used at? And eventually you also want to be able to describe the measurement settings or capture the measurement settings at which this experiment was performed, who performed it, all of that, as well as what device it was done on, what the model was, what the company was, and so on and so forth. So these are a few examples of metadata that you would be collecting if you were running this kind of experiment. In the physical sciences, particularly the environmental sciences, one example is this technology that is made available by NASA. So it's a way for people to track fires happening. So these little red dots, I think, are the fires, or should be the fires. I'm not 100% sure because I don't use this in my day-to-day. But you can imagine, like, to be able to interpret this, you maybe have a way using infrared or some other technology to measure the average temperature in the region, which can tell you if this is like normal temperatures or this is a fire. You need to also determine latitude and longitude of where these measurements are taking place so that you can actually say this is, a fire happening at this location. So this would be important metadata for someone to be able to make use of these measurements done on a satellite, for example. So I hope that gives you an idea of like what metadata is. And I do want to say that creating fair data or making data fair is no easy feat. And this is sort of, what you would do as a researcher to generate data that is fair, done from a data perspective, not so much from like, I need to write a paper perspective. So just like when you were doing your paper writing, here you have your plan, you're outlining your experiment, thinking about what kinds of data you need to collect to, falsify or support a particular hypothesis. And yeah, that takes time, right? You submit your grant application, yada, yada, you get the money, yay, you hire the people, you figure out what infrastructure you need, all of that, put everything in place, and then you start collecting the data. And at that point, at least at that point, you spent lots and lots of money on people and equipment and whatnot. It takes, in some fields, many, many years to actually collect this data because there's certain experiments that have to be done up front and whatnot to set the stage so you can collect the data. And many hands, and potentially, if you are very fortunate, you also have some robots that you've installed to help speed up the process, right? So very, very tedious, very expensive, just to collect the raw data. But oftentimes you can't use the data coming off a machine as is. You have to do some level of curation, processing, yada, yada. So you want to store and preserve that raw data, because there's many ways you can filter through it, curate it, etc., etc. But you do some level of processing and curation that also is very expensive, can take months, 2 years, depending on how advanced the pipelines for that analysis is, or the processing is, and many hands and maybe potential significant compute. So you take that process data because it's also very valuable, and you don't want everyone to start from the very beginning when this data becomes available to them, and preserve that process data. And then you go to and I did want to point out that this is very expensive on many levels as a process, and a really very nice example of why curation can be very costly on many different levels, not just money and time, but also human well-being, is the story that came out about the role of Kenyans in curating the data that went into ChatGPT. So the company obviously didn't want a lot of like toxic information to be part of that data set. Someone had to curate that toxic content off the web, right, before it got fed into their models. And they outsourced this to a company in Kenya. And the toll it took on the people who did the work was it was very harsh. And they did a very good job covering the story. So please do read it. It gives you an idea of why curation, the toll curation can take on all of us. Anyway, I digress, sorry. But now, okay, we've processed the data. Now we want to analyze it and generate insights, which is, what's going to help you falsify or prove your initial hypothesis. And again, that can take months to years, depending on how advanced the field is, and many hands and lots of computing. And so very expensive, and you also want to preserve that data. And when you're thinking about preservation, you have to think about how costly digital storage can get. Obviously, the cost is going down over time, but depending on how much data you have generated, the cost could be significant, especially if you also are tasked with doing this long term. So eventually you find a way to share this data with others, and that is, it's reused and it goes into more projects, let's say. So that's the FAIR data cycle. The way it's done in the life sciences today is that, or at least the way I do it, is as follows. We put the data in repositories. So we want the data, we don't want to be a scientist responsible for the massive amounts of data that is coming out of the consortium. So we put this data eventually, in data repositories for long-term storage. Some of those are very data type specific, which is great. Some of this ends up in supplementary files, not so great. And some of the data for which there is not yet a well characterized or repository, we could put it in in data agnostic repositories such as Zenodo. Now, I really don't like this practice, but it's the best that we could do at the moment, because I think of these data agnostic repositories as like data dumps. So we just dump the data there, but the context and the mesh, that's the metadata, is what's weaving all of this together. And we put this in a relational database that I will touch on. So the data is organized a little separately from the metadata, but we're using a relational database to weave everything together. Now, a few things about data repositories. At least in the context of my work, we always prefer to use government and funder supported repositories, because this is federal. The project that I'm working on is funded by the federal government in the US. And so, we want them to be responsible for ensuring that this data is maintained forever. And there are a couple of existing repositories that are funded by the US government to support that. Not everything has a repository, so we do use Zenodo occasionally, which is not so great. But I think when you're thinking about this stuff, it's important to think about how the geopolitics, changing geopolitics of the world will change this landscape. In the past, the US made everything available to everyone. right? So did the EU. But you might, for those of you who follow the news, right, there's a lot of tension now happening between the US and China. And China, for example, has the better repositories for some types of data that we generate, but I cannot deposit the data in those repositories because it's like a geopolitical thing. And who knows where this is going in the future, but it's important to think of data as you're thinking of data as a resource, as an asset. Uh, who's giving or gaining access to this data is going to change, I think, over time. And the other thing, so coming back to the metadata part, which is how we capture that. I think of experiments, at least in the life sciences, as like this like series of nested Russian dolls, right? Like you have the data, the most prized, most precious inner doll, but it's wrapped in information about how, if this is a sequencing example, I'm sorry to be too jargony for those of you who don't work in the life sciences or who don't use this kind of technology, but this technology we're measuring something that was obtained, DNA, for example, or RNA that was obtained from a tissue that was obtained from a monkey. So this level has its own sets of metadata, and it should be linked and embedded in all the descriptors of the previous step, which is also linked to the descriptors in the previous step, which is like the tissue and whatnot, and then the animal and how it was treated and what species it was and whether it was male or female and what age it was and all that kind of stuff. So I think of metadata organization as like describing a series of Russian dolls. And this is what it would look like in practice. So I have a non-human primate. This is not everything we collect about these, but this just gives you a flavor. Has a name, which is usually a number in the facility in which it was housed. We know it's a certain species, which arm of a study it was associated with, and the origin of the animal, for example. And then it's infected with TB on a particular visit. So these animals undergo many visits, but it was infected with TB on a particular visit. So what strain of TB is this? Does it come from a particular library, et cetera, et cetera? Who did this? Who was the tech? All of that. What was the date of the visit? All of that information is captured. And then you also capture like the date when a certain tissue was extracted. What was that tissue? Which part of the animal does it come from, et cetera, et cetera. And here we have two different tissues, one of which goes to sequencing eventually. So you're capturing like the intermediate steps of how that sample was prepped. And then eventually how it was sequenced, what was the sequencer, et cetera, et cetera. What's the technology, all of that. And the other tissue goes to another technology called flow cytometry that relies on like incubating the cells with an antibody. So what was that antibody? Who was the vendor? All of that jazz. And they're all related to each other in a nested format using like this field we call the parent field. So I know the parent of this tissue or the sample or this data was this particular library, and that library came from this particular tissue, and that tissue came from this particular animal, and so on. So it's a very simple way to organize data in a way that allows you to capture it in a piecemeal rather than all at once at the very end, which is very, very practically very difficult to do. And is well established in the data science field. So we're not the ones to invent this. That now I would mention previously that good metadata should have a key set of elements that helps you describe every experiment. So this is a non-human primate, right? What was the ID? What's the study? Who's the scientist that's working on this animal? What's its date of birth, et cetera, et cetera. We've identified a set of fields that everyone who is doing non-human primate experiments should be able to use. Vocabulary standardization is really important because scientists refer to the same thing many different ways, even if we're in the same consortium. Some people will call a control a control. Some people will call it CTRL. Other people will call it baseline. Some people will call it a reference, a negative control, many different ways. So providing people with controlled vocabularies to use as they're documenting their experiments is very, very important to facilitate, interoperability and whatnot down the line. And again, data dictionaries for comprehension is very important. So when we're using all the shorthand, MUS, PAT, NHP, PAV, like what are we talking about? No one understands that, or not everyone understands that, and there's a lot of room for confusion. So you need to like provide dictionaries for people so that they can interpret all of this stuff. And it can be a giant table like this. Again, just something digital for someone to be able to use and interpret. And finally, a tip for like what platform that allows you to do this kind of like relational database capturing. This is, you can use it in the life sciences, but you can also use it in any other context where your experiments are planned out like in this incremental, like stepwise way. And this technology is called NextSeq. It was developed by our colleagues at MIT, with whom we collaborate on managing data for Impact TB. And it has two arms. Like there's an arm that's private, which we call NextSeq. And then at the time of publication, when we're ready to push everything live, we can push it to a public-facing version called FairDom Hub. So just to summarize, this is sort of how we do data management in the life sciences at the moment, at least with an Impact TB. And, it's a hodgepodge of different pieces, which, works, but it's definitely not ideal. And I will not lie, infrastructure is not really fit for purpose in the long run, but it's better than what we have been doing in the past, for sure. So what does fair data sharing in the future look like? I think all the things that I've described, whether data or metadata, will be collected, stored, and connected in real time in the cloud with controlled access. So not everyone can see everything at a given time point. And this is already happening, I think, at some level in different areas, and will come together eventually very nicely. And the technology for that is being built or at the moment. So if just to help you visualize, you can think of your experiments to being documented in an electronic lab notebook, linked to a massive registry with metadata and controlled ontologies and all of that jazz on the back end, and linked to the data that comes off the machine in real time, being fed into the cloud. So everything is captured in that ecosystem. And at the moment, some of these versions exist, right? Whether Benchling or L7 Informatics or some version of other provider, very expensive, not very, we can't pay the money for that in academia, I think, not right now, but maybe in the future. And then on the other hand, you have people doing data analysis in the cloud and doing that in a collaborative manner. And a platform that brings all of these together will be, I think, very transformational for rapid life science discovery in the future. And some of these platforms for data analysis include Zero, DNA Nexus, Let's Bio, L7 Analytics again, and platforms like Terra. And some of them collaborate with academics and will give you free and reduced access to those platforms. So maybe worth checking out if this rings a bell for you. And it's really, really helpful for collaborative projects. But there are other caveats that I won't go into right now, but there are caveats, as with everything, to keep in mind. So to wrap, I did want to say that, with data and fair data, I think African innovation is possible. And the next breakthrough in artificial intelligence, the next multi-billion-dollar business could be coming out of Africa if we work on collecting and generating the right data, investing in talent, and building the infrastructure. And touching on data, I think local data, African data is really important for many reasons, but it's really important to inform strategic priorities in the region, right? Like whether it's satellite data, whether it's life science data, whether it's social media data, it's very valuable data, and it should be managed or at least put on servers in Africa so that African researchers and African governments can decide how this data is best used for informing strategic priorities and the like. And I think a nice example, although I don't know where this data sits, but it's WHO data, was when I was thinking of like, what do I want to do next? Like, I don't want to be an editor That's certainly not for profit organization. But I want to do something that is impactful. I want to work on an important problem. And so I was like, well, okay, COVID happened. It's transient, but what other infectious diseases are there that are wreaking havoc in the world and I don't know about? And TB was one of those. According to the WHO, it was like the 13th top killer in 2019 around the world. And when you look at data from the World Bank, it's easy to make the connection that TB is affecting the people in low and lower middle income countries. And I think that's a main reason why we have not been able to cure TB today. It's like all the money is in the global north and all the problems are in the global south. So I thought this is a problem I can work on. I am from the global south. This is a problem that is dear to me and affects people that I care about. So I think I want to work on this problem. And I couldn't have made that decision if I didn't have access to this data, right? And I also was like, well, I'm pretty sure I was vaccinated against TB when I was a kid. I have, there is a BCG vaccine. I have the scar. What is wrong? Like why is this not working? And it turns out, yes, the vaccine has existed. It's 100 years old. It's in fact the world's most widely administered vaccine, and is received by about 80% of all children worldwide. Yet TB is still a problem. And that's because I could find the paper that has the data that tells me that the existing vaccine is only effective in children up to the age of 5. And so as you grow older, its effect wanes and TB is still a problem. So thus we need to have better vaccines, right? And vaccines aside, even the drugs that are available right now are very, very, this information is also in the public domain, very difficult to administer because you need a combination of up to 4 drugs that can be dosed daily for up to 6 months. So also access to this kind of medication, even if it's cheap in some areas in the global south, can be very, very difficult. So, gives you an idea of like what are the open questions in TB, what are important things that need to be solved, and what your next research project could be. But okay, again, this is how local data can help inform strategic priorities, and that's at the individual, but I'm thinking more country and continent wide. And to do that, we need good local infrastructure. Like I said, the data should sit on African soil. It should be treated as a local asset. And to do that, you need good infrastructure. And building the public cloud of the future in the US is very expensive. We just got the money to do that from Congress recently, and it's going to take many, many years to build that. But there already exist tech companies that have built that cloud and provided as a service, that infrastructure as a service, be it Microsoft, Google, Amazon Web Services, IBM, or Oracle, right? They're all operating in that space, and forging win-win partnerships with these companies at the government level is going to be very important, I think. And local talent, investing in local talent. Not only do we need domain experts, so people who are very specialized due to their academic training in one area. We also need people who are good data scientists. We need people who are cross-sectional generalists, people who are not too specialized in either domain and can help translate between these two areas, because there's a lot of training and many, many years go into becoming a domain expert or becoming a good data scientist. And during that time, a lot of people are not learning to speak other languages. So you need someone who can bridge that divide and focus on interdisciplinary training to, help us build the tools of the future. And finally, I will say, while everything is being built, it's important to tap into the technology that already exists. So for communication between these different scientists, right? Whether it's like sharing the data, whether it's like sharing documents, whether it's meeting people who are not in the same physical space, we should use the tools that are available for us. Use existing data repositories, even if it's not African data repositories, maybe we could for now make use with what we have that is available in the global domain, and hope that, geopolitics are not going to come back and bite us in the behind, or that data is not going to be misused against people in Africa. And obviously, there's so much code that exists that is open source that we should all be tapping into rather than reinventing the wheel and discover or rewriting the same code again. Yeah, so open source software is also like really important as a resource. And I will just end on maybe two things. One a bit pessimistic, which is we should think about what data we put in the public domain. I think it's great that we want to make all the data available to everyone. Fantastic. But there are a few examples, at least in the life sciences, where I think this is not a great idea. And this has already been addressed to different extents, like either in the EU, in South Africa, I know, and in the US. So for example, patient data. In the US, there's HIPAA. In South Africa, there's POPIA. In the EU's, there's GDPR, which is like data that makes patients identifiable should never be in the public domain. That includes genetic information, because that means these individuals are susceptible, or groups even of individuals are susceptible to manipulation or discrimination. And the other thing is infectious agents, right? Like when you put all this genetic information out there in the public domain, very soon people can be using this to make the next bioweapon. So it's important to like figure out how to make this data available to the right people. And in some cases, controlled access is important. And on the more positive side, I want everyone to hopefully walk away from this with thinking that data is a very valuable resource, that we should be very thoughtful in how we handle this data and how we deposit it, and not be dumping it, especially as academics, into some kind of repository to fill some bare minimum requirement of some journal's policy. But to really think about it as like a resource that we are contributing to in the long term, that will hopefully, maybe not in our lifetime, but maybe in the lifetime of those who come after us, help us really transform the state of the African continent. And with that, I would like to thank especially Stuart Levine and his team at the Biomicro Center at MIT, the Impact TB Consortium that is funding a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment. That funding comes from the NIH, and everyone in the consortium who's been lovely for me to work with and interact with and learn from. And if you're curious, if any of you work on TB and are curious about what data sets we have generated within the consortium and are now publicly available, you can find them at this link, or reachable via scanning this QR code. And with that, I'll stop, and thank you all for being here. It's been a pleasure, and yeah, I can take questions.
Well, I could just say, wow. I think you took us on this beautiful journey that I don't know, I enjoyed every little moment of it. So I cannot thank you enough. And I think the importance of what you presented to us is that I think that most of us, or let's say me, most of the time, and the community that I work with, we treat data as, we don't cherish it. Like we use data to get results and publications, and that's it. And then this data, like, I don't know, it's not well taken care of. And I think what you said is very important, because as you said, data is an asset, and especially African data, which is scarce, and we wind up having to, since our data is not there for policymakers and for global policymakers, then we complain that these policies do not fit us. It's because our data is not there. I mean, this is the main issue. So I think we should take responsibility of that, and make sure that no matter how you think that your data is not important, I think it is definitely very important for someone out there. So I just thank you very much. I think we had a whole data management plan session in this short hour. So thank you, Douaa, very much. And Emmanuel.
Yeah, so I have a question for Douaa. I think today is the first day they actually thought about the fact that AI, artificial intelligence, can also easily read or get access to the data we openly share. So we have to think about it. So it's quite interesting. Do you have any suggestions for how we can balance this thing? Because you clearly stated that AI, unlike humans, do not maybe have this form of empathy and how we understand some of these things the way a human would do. And maybe kind of know this information, I shouldn't bring it out or stuff like that. But I think the AI just accesses anything. And anyone who has access to AI can also access anything that the AI can access. So in an age where we are sharing data openly, and we are also in the age of AI, artificial intelligence, so how do we balance that? Because it was an interesting point that you brought up. So how do we balance that? Because we are pushing for open data, but then we also have to look at that aspect too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question and a very important point that people have to be thinking about. And it's always about like cost benefit, right? I feel like thinking about who, if this data is in the public domain, who might be harmed by it versus what are the benefits that can be achieved by making it available is the way to go. And this is a policymaker's job, really. There has to be an entire like division. I think the Emirates, for example, has an AI office, like what do you want to call it? Like like the Office of Education, they have a ministry for artificial intelligence. And these people, their job is to be thinking about these things and figuring out what the national policy is when it comes to certain types of data. I can tell you in the US, the NIH had sent out after the COVID-19 had sent out and like suspicions of like this being a engineered virus in China that broke out of the lab. And like there's a lot of like political weight to some of that. It was complex. I don't want to be propagating things that are potentially wrong, but this idea, just this thought that what if one of our researchers in good faith accidentally something went wrong and whatever their engineering goes out, right? What are we going to do then? And we have a lot of information, we have a lot of data now about bugs that are either infectious agents or not infectious agents. And you can just think about researchers and AI coming together and figuring out what makes an agent pathogenic and figuring out what makes it resistant to antibiotics, right? We already know some of this stuff, right? But doing this in more sophisticated and ways and at scale, very quickly, engineering bioweapons is not going to be very difficult. So is it worth it? Is it worth putting infectious disease agent sequences in the public domain? They sent out, I think the Congress are thinking about this, and they sent out a call for information from researchers in the field to comment on it and provide feedback. And I think they're weighing the pros and cons of this to have regulation that decides whether or not this information should still sit in the public domain in the future. It does right now, but whether or not it will in the future, I think, is to be determined. And we need to learn from these, mistakes in the past. We have to be imaginative and creative about how certain data can be eventually used against some people. What's the size of this group? Are they already a disadvantaged group? Does it, like there's so much that goes into thinking about this, and people just have to start thinking about it. I think we were not, at least in the US, thinking about this. And I think in parts of Africa, people have been thinking about this more than others. And there has to be a lot more effort in thinking critically about this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Douaa.
So I think we have about a minute left, but I was wondering if any of the audience had a question for Douaa.
I should have put my email.
Maybe you could share it in the chat.
Yeah, if anyone has questions, that come to them after. Please feel free to email me. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect and chat about all things data. And yeah, if no one has any pressing questions, it was a pleasure being the inaugural speaker.
Yeah, we're like, we
Like
cannot tell you how proud and happy we are for you to start this whole series, and we hope that our community, by seeing your session, would encourage, you know, we're getting encouraged to participate, and as you said, it's always nice to spread the knowledge that you have, especially if you have knowledge coming from different parts of the world. It's very important to spread it to the local community and to help them out. So we cannot thank you enough, to be honest, Douaa, for this amazing session.
Pleasure is mine, and I really look forward to learning from others too. So very excited. Thank you so much.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Douaa. Thank you for our attendees. And we hope to see you in an upcoming session. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.